Sarah Martinez had perfected the art of being invisible. At 26, she moved through the Naval Intelligence Building like a ghost, her footsteps silent on polished floors, her presence barely registering in rooms full of decorated officers. This morning was no different as she entered the briefing room at 0630 hours, 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting. The coffee station sat in the corner, a simple aluminum pot that had seen better days. Sarah approached it with practiced efficiency, pulling her plain white mug from the cabinet. She had learned early in her career that drawing attention was dangerous. Better to blend in, to be the quiet analyst who delivered reports on time and never caused waves. As she poured the dark liquid, steam rising in delicate spirals, Sarah's mind wandered to the encrypted files she'd been analyzing for months. Patterns, hidden in seemingly random data, communications that didn't quite add up, a puzzle that kept her awake at night, pieces scattered across her desk like fallen leaves. The door opened with a sharp crack, and voices filled the previously silent room. Sarah didn't turn around. She knew the routine. Senior officers would file in, take their seats at the massive oak table, and begin discussing matters far above her clearance level. She would sit in the back, take notes, and speak only when spoken to. Admiral Richardson entered first, his presence commanding even in the simple act of walking. Behind him came Captain Williams, Commander Torres, and a handful of other officers whose names Sarah knew but who had never bothered to learn hers. She was just another analyst, another face in the crowd of intelligence personnel who kept the Navy's secrets safe. Sarah stirred her coffee slowly, the metal spoon creating tiny whirlpools in the brown surface. She had added no sugar, no cream, black coffee for a black and white world where right and wrong were supposed to be clearly defined. But her recent discoveries had painted everything in shades of gray. The officers settled into their chairs with the familiar sounds of rustling papers and clearing throats. Sarah finally turned from the coffee station, her mug warming her hands as she moved toward her usual spot near the back wall. She had attended dozens of these briefings over the past 2 years, always as an observer, never as a participant. Her supervisor, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, nodded briefly in her direction. It was the only acknowledgement she expected or wanted. Hayes had been good to her, protecting her from the more aggressive personalities in the department, while giving her space to do what she did best: find patterns where others saw only chaos. Sarah pulled out her worn leather notebook and clicked her pen twice, a nervous habit she'd developed in college. The room settled into the familiar rhythm of a morning briefing: weather reports, operational updates, personnel changes. Nothing that required her expertise or attention. She sipped her coffee and let her mind drift back to the files. 3 months of data that told a story nobody wanted to hear. Communications between allied nations that suggested something far more sinister than the routine intelligence sharing they appeared to be. Financial transactions that created a web of connections spanning 3 continents. The Admiral was discussing supply chain logistics when Sarah noticed him pause mid-sentence. She looked up from her notebook to find him staring directly at her, his steel-gray eyes holding an intensity that made her stomach clench. The room had grown quiet. Too quiet. Sarah could hear the ventilation system humming overhead, the distant sound of traffic from the street outside, even the soft ticking of the wall clock. But no voices, no shuffling papers, nothing. She lowered her coffee mug to her lap, suddenly aware that every eye in the room was on her. Her heart began to race, though she couldn't understand why. She hadn't said anything, hadn't moved from her chair, hadn't done anything to draw attention to herself. Admiral Richardson set down his papers with deliberate precision. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades of command. Each word measured and clear. "Analyst Martinez," he said. And Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. He knew her name. Not only did he know her name, but he was addressing her directly in front of the entire senior staff. She managed a barely audible, "Yes, sir," her voice catching slightly on the words. The Admiral leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I understand you've been doing some interesting reading lately." It wasn't a question. It was a statement that sent ice through her veins. Her work was classified, compartmentalized, known only to Hayes and herself. How could the Admiral possibly know what she'd been analyzing? Sarah glanced toward Hayes, looking for guidance. but found only a carefully neutral expression that told her nothing. She was on her own in whatever was about to happen. "I've been working on routine analysis, sir," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The Admiral's eyes never left her face. "Nothing routine about what you've uncovered, analyst. Nothing routine at all." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt trapped between honesty and self-preservation, between duty and discretion. She had stumbled onto something significant, something that connected dots in ways that made powerful people very uncomfortable. And somehow, word had reached the highest levels of command. Her coffee had grown cold in her hands, but she didn't dare move to set it down. The room remained frozen in this moment of tension, waiting for her next words. Sarah realized that everything she had worked for, everything she had built in her careful, invisible career, balanced on the edge of what she said next. The silence stretched longer, becoming almost unbearable. Admiral Richardson continued to study her with those penetrating eyes, while around the table, the other officers waited with barely concealed curiosity. This was clearly not part of the scheduled briefing. This was something else entirely. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. The Admiral knew about her work, but how much did he know? And more importantly, was she in trouble, or was this something else entirely? Her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee mug, the ceramic suddenly feeling slippery against her palms. "Sir," she began carefully, "I'm not sure what specific analysis you're referring to." Admiral Richardson's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't buying her attempt at ignorance. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, placing it on the table with deliberate precision. "Operation Nightfall," he said simply. Sarah's blood turned to ice. That was her code name for the investigation, something she had written only in her private notes, never in any official report. The fact that he knew it meant someone had been watching her work very closely. Or worse, someone had access to her personal files. She looked around the room, suddenly aware that this was no ordinary briefing. The faces staring back at her weren't showing the boredom and routine attention she was used to seeing. Instead, there was tension, anticipation, and something that looked almost like respect. Admiral Richardson opened the folder and began reading from what appeared to be a summary document. 3 months ago, Analyst Martinez identified unusual patterns in routine communications between Allied naval forces. Rather than dismissing these anomalies as technical glitches or administrative errors, she chose to dig deeper. Sarah's heart pounded as he continued. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Her investigation was unauthorized, conducted during her personal time using resources she probably shouldn't have accessed. She had been careful, or so she thought. Her analysis revealed a coordinated effort to funnel military intelligence to unauthorized parties through what appeared to be routine logistics communications. The scheme was sophisticated, using military code words embedded in supply requests and personnel transfers to mask the real data being transmitted. The room was completely silent now. Sarah realized that not only was her work being acknowledged, but it was being praised. The Admiral wasn't here to discipline her. He was here for something else entirely. Furthermore, Richardson continued, Analyst Martinez identified 17 separate individuals across 4 Allied nations who were participating in this network, including 3 with access to NATO classified materials. Sarah's mouth went dry. She had suspected the scope was large, but hearing it laid out so clearly made the magnitude of what she had uncovered truly real. These weren't small-time operators or opportunistic individuals. This was organized espionage at the highest levels. Captain Williams leaned forward in his chair. How did she identify the participants without alerting them to our investigation? Admiral Richardson looked directly at Sarah. Perhaps she can explain her methodology herself. All eyes turned to her again, but this time the attention felt different. They weren't looking at the invisible analyst who poured coffee in the corner. They were looking at someone whose work mattered. Someone who had accomplished something significant. Sarah cleared her throat and set her coffee mug on the small table beside her chair. I noticed that certain supply requests were being approved faster than normal protocol allowed. When I mapped the approval times against personnel locations and communication logs, I found that specific individuals were always present during these expedited processes. She paused, gauging the room's reaction. The officers were listening intently, and Admiral Richardson nodded encouragingly. I created a database tracking communication patterns, cross-referencing timing with personnel movements and supply chain anomalies. The same names kept appearing, but never in obvious ways. They were careful to avoid direct contact, using intermediaries and delayed communications to mask their coordination. Commander Torres spoke up. How long did this analysis take? 3 months of evening work, sir. I used only declassified databases and publicly available scheduling information. I never accessed anything beyond my clearance level. End of I. Admiral Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly. You accomplished this using only open sources? Yes, sir. The pattern was visible if you knew how to look for it, but it required connecting data points across multiple systems that don't normally cross-reference. The Admiral closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. Analyst Martinez, your work has prevented what could have been the largest intelligence breach in NATO history. The network you identified had been operating for nearly 2 years before you spotted it. Sarah felt dizzy. The scope of what she had stumbled into was far beyond anything she had imagined. She had thought she was tracking minor irregularities, not a major espionage operation. There's something else, Admiral Richardson continued, his tone becoming more serious. The reason this briefing is happening today is because we've confirmed your analysis through independent sources. Every individual you identified has been placed under surveillance, and preliminary evidence supports your conclusions. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as the implications sank in. Sarah's unauthorized investigation had not only been accurate but had provided the foundation for a major counterintelligence operation. Sir, Sarah said hesitantly, I hope I didn't overstep any boundaries. I was just following patterns that seemed significant. Admiral Richardson stood up, and everyone in the room instinctively straightened. Analyst Martinez, you did exactly what every intelligence professional should do when they spot something that doesn't add up. You investigated thoroughly, documented everything, and did so without compromising operational security. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. Sarah felt incredibly small in her chair, looking up at one of the most powerful officers in the Navy. But there's one more thing we need to discuss, he said, his voice taking on a different tone. The individuals you identified know that someone has been tracking them. They've made moves in the past week that suggest they're aware of our investigation. Sarah's stomach dropped. If the targets knew they were being watched, then they also might know who had been watching them. Her careful, invisible existence was about to become very visible indeed. Which brings us to why you're really here today, Admiral Richardson continued. We need your help to finish what you started. Sarah stared at Admiral Richardson, trying to process his words. The quiet analyst who had spent years avoiding attention was suddenly at the center of a major intelligence operation. The irony wasn't lost on her that her attempts to stay invisible had led to the most visible moment of her career. Sir, she said carefully, I'm not sure how I can help beyond what I've already provided. I'm just an analyst. Admiral Richardson returned to his seat but kept his eyes on her. You're the only person who understands this network completely. You built the analysis framework from the ground up. We need you to help us predict their next moves. Captain Williams opened a laptop and turned it toward the room. Show her the latest intercepts. The screen displayed a series of communications that looked like routine naval messaging traffic. But Sarah could see immediately what had alarmed them. The pattern she had identified was accelerating, becoming more urgent and less carefully concealed. They're preparing to extract, she said without thinking, then caught herself. I mean, it looks like they're rushing to complete something before shutting down the operation. Commander Torres leaned forward. Extract what? Sarah studied the screen more carefully, her analytical mind automatically processing the data. Based on the communication frequency and the personnel involved, I'd estimate they have a final intelligence package they're trying to deliver. Something big enough that they're willing to risk exposure to complete the transfer. The room exchanged glances, and Sarah realized she had just provided exactly the kind of insight they needed. Her years of careful observation and pattern recognition had given her an intuitive understanding of how intelligence operations worked. Admiral Richardson stood again and walked to the wall-mounted display screen. Ladies and gentlemen, We have a problem. Our counterintelligence teams have confirmed that someone within this network has access to operation details for Allied naval exercise Trident, scheduled to begin in 6 days. Sarah's heart stopped. Trident was the largest multinational naval exercise in a decade, involving sensitive tactical information, new weapon systems, and coordinated strategies that would define Allied naval doctrine for years to come. If that information reached hostile nations, it could compromise military advantages that had taken decades to develop. The exercise involves 12 nations, 47 ships, and classified technologies that represent the cutting edge of naval warfare, Richardson continued. If this intelligence is compromised, we're not just talking about embarrassment. We're talking about a fundamental shift in global naval power balance. Sarah found herself standing without realizing it, her analytical mind fully engaged despite the overwhelming nature of the situation. Sir, based on the communication patterns I've observed, the final transfer is likely planned for sometime in the next 72 hours. They need time to extract their people before the exercise begins, and security protocols intensify. Can you identify the likely transfer method? Captain Williams asked. Sarah moved to the display screen, studying the data with fresh eyes. May I? She asked, gesturing to the computer controls. Admiral Richardson nodded, and Sarah began pulling up additional databases, cross-referencing the latest communications with historical patterns. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she built a real-time analysis of the network's behavior. Here, she said, pointing to a cluster of data points on the screen. Communications between these 3 individuals have shifted from their normal pattern. Instead of using supply requisition codes, they're now using personnel transfer requests. That suggests they're planning to physically move someone or something. She paused, studying the screen more intently. And look at this timing pattern. The messages are being sent at exactly 18-hour intervals, which corresponds to specific shift changes at 3 different naval facilities. The room watched in fascination as Sarah built her analysis in real time, connecting dots that had been invisible to others. Years of quiet observation had taught her to see patterns in human behavior that even experienced intelligence officers missed. They're using the shift changes to mask physical access to secure areas, she continued. Someone is being rotated between facilities to gather the final intelligence pieces. Based on the timing, they'll complete the circuit in. She paused to calculate. 36 hours. 36 hours. Admiral Richardson approached the screen. Can you identify which facilities? Sarah pulled up additional data and began mapping personnel schedules against communication timings. Norfolk Naval Base, Naval Station Newport. And, this one's harder to pin down, but based on the communication delays, somewhere in the DC area, probably the Pentagon or Naval Intelligence Command. The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. If someone had rotating access to all 3 locations, they weren't dealing with a low-level operator. This was someone with significant clearance and authorization. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice growing more confident as the analysis took shape. The communication pattern suggests they're not just gathering intelligence, they're also positioning themselves to disrupt the exercise itself. Look at these timing correlations. She highlighted a series of data points that showed communications occurring precisely when critical exercise planning meetings were scheduled. Someone is feeding real-time strategic decisions to the network. They're not just stealing plans. They're monitoring our response to their theft. Okay. Our response to their theft. The room erupted in concerned murmurs. This was far beyond simple espionage. This was active sabotage of a major military operation. Admiral Richardson moved to the secure phone on the wall. I need to contact Joint Chiefs immediately, he said, then paused and looked back at Sarah. Analyst Martinez? How confident are you in this assessment? Sarah considered the question carefully. Everything in her training told her to hedge, to qualify her statements, to avoid making definitive claims. But the data was clear, and the stakes were too high for diplomatic uncertainty. 95% confidence, sir. The pattern is unmistakable once you know how to read it. Admiral Richardson nodded and lifted the secure phone. But before he could dial, he turned back to the room one more time. "I want everyone to understand what just happened here," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. Analyst Martinez didn't just identify a security breach. She potentially saved Allied naval operations from catastrophic compromise. He looked directly at Sarah, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a formality that made everyone in the room straighten. Effective immediately, Analyst Martinez is assigned to Special Intelligence Task Force Trident with Emergency Security Clearance Elevation. Her call sign for this operation will be Pattern. The room fell completely silent. Sarah realized that in the span of one morning, her entire career had changed. She was no longer the invisible analyst pouring coffee in the corner. She was now an active participant in one of the most critical intelligence operations in recent memory. As Admiral Richardson began making his urgent phone calls, and the room erupted into coordinated activity, Sarah remained standing at the display screen, staring at the data that had changed everything. Her quiet observation had led to this moment, but she understood that the real work was just beginning. The coffee she had poured so carefully that morning sat forgotten and cold. But Sarah barely noticed. She was no longer trying to be invisible. For the first time in her career, she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. And as the room buzzed with urgent preparation around her, she felt something she had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that her voice would be heard.